All right. Good evening. Good evening to everyone here, to everyone present. We are glad tonight to be able to join together and gather around God's holy word. Tonight, we're going to be going through 1 Corinthians 10, 15 verses, 1 Corinthians 10, verses 15 until the first verse of the next chapter. So if you're there at home, you're together here on Zoom, I'm going to read the passage, and you can join me in a word of prayer. So let's start. I'm going to share my screen here so you can read along. It's a great passage, a passage full of things that we are very much familiar with. It is a joy, as always, to be able to read the word and study the word with you guys. I'm glad that we're able to still do that, and I pray that this time may be a blessing to you, and studying the word also is a blessing to me. So you can follow along with me, and I'll start us up here. 1 Corinthians 10, verse 15. I speak as to sensible people. Judge for yourselves what I say. The cup of blessing that we bless is not a participation in the blood of Christ. The bread that we break is not a participation in the body of Christ. Because there is one bread, we who are many are one body, for we all partake of the one bread. Verse 18, consider the people of Israel. Are not those who eat the sacrifices participants in the altar? What do I imply then? That food offered to idols is anything, or that an idol is anything? No, I imply that what pagans sacrifice, they offer to demons and not to God. I do not want you to be participants with demons. You cannot drink the cup of the Lord and the cup of demons. You cannot partake of the table of the Lord and the table of demons. Shall we provoke the Lord to jealousy? Are we stronger than he? All things are lawful, but not all things are helpful. All things are lawful, but not all things build up. Let no one seek his own good, but the good of his neighbor. Eat whatever is sold in the meat market without raising any question in the ground of conscience. For the earth is the Lord and the fullness thereof. If one of the unbelievers invites you to dinner and you are disposed to go, eat whatever is disposed before you without raising any question on the ground of conscience. But if someone says to you, this has been offered in sacrifice, then do not eat it, for the sake of the one who informed you and for the sake of conscience. I do not mean your conscience, but his. For why should my liberty be determined by someone else's conscience? If I partake with thankfulness, why am I denounced because of that for which I give thanks? Let's read this last part of the passage. Verse 31. So whether you eat or drink or whatever you do, do all to the glory of God. Give no offense to Jews or to Greeks or to the church of God, just as I try to please everyone in everything that I do, not seeking my own advantage, but that of many, that they may be saved. Verse 11:1. Be imitators of me as I am of Christ. So join me in a word of prayer. God, we thank you for this time here together. Lord, we are here obedient to what you have called us to, Lord, to gather together in this time, Lord, in whatever means possible, to be devoted to your word. Lord, bless us by your scriptures, God. And Lord, I pray for what we just read. Lord, help us to live for your glory. Help us to flee for anything that can come under the category of idolatry, and show us, Lord, how to differentiate and discern both. And God, help us to apply several principles that are inside of this passage. Help us to be a loving community, thoughtful of one another. Lord, the matter of conscience is raised in this passage, Lord, and in this current time. I see that our conscience and our moral compass is low. I pray, God, that you may increase, Lord, in me and in us as a church, as a gathering of believers, Lord, increase our conscience. Help us to be guided by that, and help us to apply these principles, wise and loving. God, as we seek to edify one another, Lord, we know that you are faithful to build your church. Lord, build, Lord, a church in us, God, that we may be edified, that we may be edified and be edifying others, that we may be, Lord, glorifying you and loving other people as well. Father, help us to be the church that is after your heart and after glorifying you, God. I pray that for us as we go through this time together, God. I pray that that you may give us clarity and that we may have a good time now as we go through your passage and afterwards as we have time in fellowship, Lord, remotely. We thank you, Lord, because we can see already the end of this quarantine and the day that will hopefully come soon, we'll be able to gather together physically. We thank you for your grace. We thank you for this time. In Jesus' name, amen. All right. So for all of us that are here, we are going to go through a bit of verses today. And we're going to go through practically two chunks, verses 15 to verse, give me a second here, practically verse 22. And then afterwards from 23 to 33, 23 to the beginning of chapter 11, we'll go through that next passage. So we're kind of like two-parted here, from verse 15 onto verse 22 and 23 onto 11:1. And we have a little recap of what we have been covering already. We have been talking about the matters of Christian freedom in the last chapters, chapter 9, chapter 10. We're already like finishing chapter 10, and we're going to get into a whole different category of things next week. But chapter 8, we're talking about principles about acting upon the knowledge of the existence of idols. Then chapter 9 is a huge illustration of Paul's life and what he did with his own, with his personal freedom, with his Christian freedom, when it comes to questionable things, and how he lived his life and he let go of his rights for the sake of winning other people to Christ. And here we get into chapter 10. And last week we just had a big warning to even though we are spiritual blessed, we have to be careful to still keep on standing in Christ. Gave the whole example of Israel. It gave a warning to people who were overconfident. That's simply what the last week's passage was, to stand strong and be careful not to fall. Today, the big point is practically verse 14. We're sandwiched by very good, interesting verses. Verse 14 says, flee from idolatry. Verse 11:1 says that we are to imitate Christ. And this first passage from this first half that we're going to cover right now is going to practically focus on the negative, and then we're going to go on to like a more positive note. Flee from this, seek to pursue this. If we flee from idolatry in some way or another, we can run to Christ and seek his example. So we're going to feel that transition as we go through this passage now. We are, the big point is of this passage for the beginning passage is simple. It's verse 14. If you guys are in front of your Bible there, you guys can see that he calls them beloved brethren. There's the only verse that's not going to be on your screens there. Verse 14 says, therefore, my beloved, flee from idolatry. That's the big point, to flee from idolatry. There's the big point that we're going to be talking about. To those people that he loved, he says, you guys, please flee from idolatry. We're going to get right now into verse 15, but we're going to talk about the Lord's Supper here. We have heard about that passage beforehand. I wanted you guys to see how it is applied in context. And afterwards, we're going to get into glorifying God, especially in verse 10, in verse 3:1, where it's a very famous verse. That's whatever you eat, whatever you drink, do it all for the glory of God. I hope that these matters as we go through this passage, these two concepts of glorifying God and the Lord's Supper are going to be very helpful once we understand it in light of the last chapters that we have talked about. So, gray matters, Christian freedom. What do we do? Let's look at verse 15 and we'll start from there. Verse 15 says, still in a little bit of an introduction of what we're going to be talking about, I speak as to sensible people. In another book, in another version, it says, as wise people. Hey, you Corinthian people that consider yourselves wise, as they claim to be, feel a spiritual pride and consider themselves as very wise. He says, okay, I speak to you as sensible people, as wise people. Judge well. what I am about to say. So I am speaking, judge and discern what I am about to say. This is in part of introduction to what he's going to be talking about in this chapter. Look at the situation that I'm going to be placed before you, and the same I'm saying to all of us. Judge well everything that he is going to bring into mind, because the matter of conscience and conviction and loving others, honestly, I've been in this passage beforehand. It takes a lot of, for me personally, it takes mental effort to kind of appropriate these principles, maybe because they're alien to us, maybe because it's not simply our usual. I felt convicted by this passage beforehand when I read it like years ago. I didn't quite understand it. Now I can understand it better, and it's a bit more convicting, but it takes a lot of mental effort to kind of understand the situation here. He is going to talk about what to do with idolatrous foods and conscience. So we're going to dive right into that. But before that, even though he is going to explain all the reasons about fleeing idolatry, I think it's important to note that verse 14, he already states, without reasoning with them, without giving them the reasons, he already says, I'm going to write down right up here. He already states that the command, flee anything idolatrous. Now he's going to give them the reasons, but I thought it was important to note that before he even gives them the reasons, he simply gives the command. Now we're going to have an introduction here to the Lord's, starting in verse 16, to the Lord's table. Verse 16, think about this, guys. The cup of blessing that we bless, is it not a participation in the blood of Christ? So the cup of blessing, talking about the Lord's table, simply saying it is a participation of the blood of Christ. And then here he comes with the bread. So we have these two elements here. The bread that we break is not a participation in the body of Christ. He's simply saying the partaking that we have with the blood and the body, it's not literal, but it is a participation. Then look at verse 17, because a little bit of more deepening into what he is saying here about the Lord's table. Because there is one bread, we who are many are one body, for we all partake of the one bread. Verse 18, consider the people of Israel, kind of deepening that thought here in the Old Testament. Are not those who eat the sacrifices participants of the altar? So he brings in the topic of the Lord's table. Why does he bring that in when he is talking about idolatrous foods? What about food being offered to idols? Remember that there's all that we're talking about. He says that there's a kind of like a misuse, a disorder when it comes to food being offered to idols. Some people are eating it, some people can't eat it. They're dealing with this whole thing here. And he says, hey, what about the Lord's table? Consider that. What is going on here? Well, just like there is a partaking of a food in the temple of idols, he brings up the Lord's table. Let's see how they connect. They are partaking of something. They're simply saying, the big thought here, simply just gonna place this before you guys. He's saying, you guys are kind of messed up, or kind of are not interacting well with a food that is offered to idols. And they're thinking about things very practically. You're saying, idols don't exist. It's just meat. It's whatever. And they say, wait, before you get into that whole thing, think about what is actually taking place there. You guys are going there and eating in the temple restaurant, partaking and having fellowship with all these people, and the food being offered to idols. When the food was being, when we are dealing with the Lord's table, for example, isn't there something kind of a big deal happening there? I think one of the thoughts that is bringing to mind just by him bringing the Lord's table is there's deeper things, there's bigger things going on here. What is going on with the Lord's table? In the Lord's table, we're grabbing a couple of elements, and we are doing something spiritual with something physical, and it's something that matters to God a lot. He also brings up in verse 18 the matter of the Old Testament and the people with sacrifices. They're doing something simple with something physical, but it dives into the spiritual. When the Old Testament people performed the sacrifice, it was a way for them to remember the sacrifice that was to come. And in a sense, we see the Old Testament people, and that was counted to them as righteousness because they were trusting God for the sacrifice that was to come. Now with the Lord's table, we are remembering the sacrifice that came for us. Old Testament people, New Testament people. And obviously, if we can say, hey, if I start thinking as a Corinthian person and see that Paul is saying that, okay, then I would think about, obviously, we're not literally eating Jesus. There's not literally Jesus that we're eating. And I just want to make that little note there, because it is maybe a false teaching that is going on, especially with the Catholic background that I know a lot of us Hispanics are surrounded by. I'm going to write it down on our screens there. This term right here, which is a scholar term for something of the Catholic people, the Catholic religion practices, transubstantiation. Maybe a lot of you guys haven't heard about this term. It's a very scholastic term. Transubstantiation. Missed an N here. But this topic right here, this term right here, defines what some of the Catholic people believe. The Catholic people believe on the conversion. They partake of the Lord's table. They take what they call the Eucharist, and they believe on the conversion of those elements, and they literally become, as you partake in them, the body of Jesus Christ. When you partake of the bread and the wine, they believe that there's a supernatural thing going on, and they believe that it's the body and the blood of Christ that they're ingesting. They believe that practically they're maintaining salvation by partaking of this in Mass. That's not what the Bible teaches. In Mark 14, verse 22-24, we have the implementation of the Lord's Supper by Jesus Christ. And I'll read it for you guys. And as they were eating, he took bread, and after blessing it, broke them and gave it to them and said, "Take, this is my body." And he took a cup. When he had given thanks, he gave it to them, and they all drank of it. And he said to them, "This is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many." Obviously, Jesus is right there. And they knew they were not drinking his blood. They were not drinking his body. And they knew this was, to Jewish people, this was very similar to the Passover. It had nothing to do with with Jesus' literal blood and literal body. They were simply like seeing bread in front of them, and they just saw wine being served, and they thought, okay, there's something going on here. And now we understand it's a symbol, it's a memorial practice, a sacrament of Jesus' sacrifice for us. We partake of the Lord's Supper, and we participate in Jesus' sacrifice, his blood, his body, his death, his resurrection. We die with him and we are resurrected with him. We are simply saying that we are part of Jesus Christ's body, and we are remembering that in the partaking of the Lord's Supper. That's what he's bringing up. And he's simply saying the Lord's Supper is a huge deal. For the Jewish ears, they would understand it was a passing on, like a little a part of the Passover. The Passover meal was way bigger. I'm not going to get into that, but there was a huge Passover meal for the Jewish people that had a lot of other elements. There's kind of like a smaller Passover meal as a remembrance of Jesus Christ. And there's a supernatural thing that is happening with natural things. Even though we're dealing with physical things, we are saying, even in this passage, that we are partaking with Jesus Christ. We are partaking with each other. I'm sharing all of this not only to inform the wrong understanding that there is of the Lord's Supper, not only to bring clarity to the passage, but also, if I can speak more personally, I think one of the things that I got from this, and I think I can say that for us as a whole, we have to build up our understanding or our doctrine of the Lord's Supper. Because Paul is simply saying here in this passage, when we take of the cup, when we take of the bread, there is a supernatural, a spiritual participation that is going on with God and with each other. So this is a little bit of, I'm explaining all that to bring clarity, but also to bring up this side application. What do you think when you take the Lord's table? What do you think when you take the Lord's Supper? Do you, it simply kind of like refreshes and brings to mind something that is already there. It's kind of, but not really. Like when you give a flower to a loved one, it kind of like, it's something that is experienced that kind of like quickens you or brings up to you a physical thing that brings up this matter, reminds you about a love for somebody else, a romantic love. Well, there's something spiritual going on when we're doing the Lord's Supper, we're partaking with something physical, and it reminds us of something spiritual. So back to the passage's point, he says, you are partaking with something spiritual. There's something that transcends from that practice, right? So you guys are going to church and doing church there, Corinthian people, and you guys are partaking of the Lord's table, right? And they would say, yeah. Isn't that something kind of supernatural and spiritual going on there? The answer is yes. So if that is happening in the Lord's table, then why are you guys taking so lightly the meat being offered to idols? Hope you guys get to see that connection. That's why he's bringing that up. He's saying, hey, you guys are taking part in the Lord's table. Something supernatural and spiritual is happening with physical things. Don't take the other stuff so lightly. There's obviously more serious things going on here. Don't take like, hey, it's just meat offered to idols. We can just eat here at the temple. There's deeper things going on there. There is spiritual things, supernatural things going on right there in the temple that you guys are eating. So he says, judge wisely. And before that, in verse 14, he says, you guys should be fleeing from idolatry. I like how he also says in verse 17, I'm going to share my screen here so you can kind of like see the connection. He says in verse 17, when we partake of the Lord's Supper, as we are participating with our supernatural being, God, are we also participating with one another? Verse 17, because there is one bread, we who are many are one body. We're going to get more into that. Maybe if you guys have already read Corinthians and are thinking about the book as a whole, maybe you guys are thinking already with chapter 12 here coming up about being one body. But here it's simply talking about the aspect of we are kind of like in fellowship, in holy fellowship, when we are participating in the Lord's table, kind of like the same in the OT. We have the Old Testament example here. We have a New Testament example right here, saying these two examples, we're kind of participating with each other. We're having holy communion, this holy practice, this sacrament. Now, he brought this to mind. And before we get into verse 19, where he's going to be talking about idolatry, notice one of the key words to understand this passage is the word participant. It's all over the place. Participation. We who are many are one body. There's a sense of like fellowship, co-participating there. And the Old Testament example, there's participation there with the physical things. It kind of transcends, and they say there's a kind of a union there, a co-participation, a partaking with each other. Let's call it, I'm going to put it right here, a holy or a specific kind of, let me put it right here, co-participating or co-participant, or kind of put here the word fellowship because it's sharing with one another. It just reminds me of that we're having as we say, a holy communion. That's what he's bringing up here. This idea that we are united. with God and with each other. Now we are left with question marks after this, and we hear that from Paul. He says in verse 19, hey, what do I imply then? What am I implying? That food offered to idols is anything? Or that an idol is anything? He's kind of saying, I'm not saying that. He's reassuring the people from the past, hey, we don't believe there's any idols. We can partake with the meats that are being cut up in the temple, right? Idols are not anything. That's what they said chapters ago. And he's saying, I'm not implying here that idols or anything like the food offered to idols is anything. That's he's agreeing with them and saying they're nothing. They're nobodies. Nor idols, nor the food offered to idols. But here's where it gets concerning. He's implying something even deeper in verse 20. I imply that what pagan sacrifice they offer to demons, not to God. I do not want you to be what? Participants with demons. That's verse 20 for us. So, point here that he's saying is that this whole idol thing that's going on, this whole idolatry thing and this idol thing is not that it's anything in and of itself. He's saying actually that it's participation with demons, a whole more concerning thing. So we kind of like have a gap. If I was in the church of Corinth, I would get kind of have a gasp of relief. It's like, man, is it like a big deal? Do idols really exist? Okay, Paul just agreed that idols do not exist. And he says, it's actually not about idols. It's actually about demons. Now that is actually more concerning. He's saying that idolatry is participating with demons. What is going on here? This is this can give a lot of clarity to maybe some of the question marks that we may think about supernatural things that happen outside of God, or this happenings that happen in kind of like quote unquote miracles that even happen with other religions. This can bring up a lot of clarity towards that. If you guys can follow me to Deuteronomy 32:17 in your Bibles, I'm going to ask you guys to together, and I'll go there as well. We can read it together. There's Deuteronomy, back at the beginning of the Bible. Deuteronomy 32:17 simply states, they sacrificed to demons that were no gods, to gods they had never known, to new gods that had come recently, whom your fathers had never dreaded. You were mindful of the rock that bore you, and you forgot the God who gave you birth. They sacrificed to demons that were not gods. They gave sacrifices to, this is mentioning the fact that they were sacrificed to cows or other idols that they made with their hands, with wood or with gold. And he's saying, actually, they're not idols. We're talking about demons here. This is affirming that simply any supernatural thing that is happening in any kind of religion outside of God is enabled and enforced by demons. Demons, what happens with some of these fake religions is that it's not that the idol is true, it's that the demons make people believe that it's true. It's not that the miracles are not happening, they might be happening, but it is demonic, supernatural miracles. Some of the miracles that happen in different kind of religions or in cults, Satan and his demons are interested to people to be sold out to that. So they enable and they kind of act on their power to make people believe that the spiritual, the idol or whatever religion or cult there is, they make people believe that it's real by the demons affirming and empowering those things. So when we hear some kind of like miracle happening outside of God, which is also recorded in scripture, there's a lot of spiritual, supernatural things that happen and they're not from God. Where is it from? Demons. Satan, demons allow those things to happen and make those things happen with an agenda. They want people to believe something that is not God. they are for the agenda of idolatry. As people want idols and make false religions and make cults, the demons and Satan just fall into a force and help and empower that agenda and actually give it their stamp of approval and make supernatural acts that make people even believe it even more. These people are sacrificing, as this verse says, they are sacrificing not to gods, but to demons. And the fact that they're, to the Corinthian ears, what they were listening was like, it's not that the idol does not exist. Paul says, I completely agree. But everything that is happening in those temples with those idols, and the crazy thing that happens there, don't think that that is completely innocent. There's demonic activity in those places. Don't deal with these dark matters so lightly, or think we can do whatever we want and we can eat in the temple, to the temple's restaurant. You guys are pretty near to demonic activity. Don't take it lightly. Take it, honestly, give it a sense of cautiousness. And in verse 14, it actually says, flee from anything related to them. Verse 21, let me jump right in there, and then I'll give a moment where you guys can just step into the chat and put any comments or thought that you guys may have. Reinforces the opposite nature of these two things. You cannot drink the cup of the Lord and the cup of demons. You cannot participate in the cup of the Lord and the cup of demons. You cannot partake in the table of the Lord and also the table of demons. So, simply said, you guys are taking the Lord's Supper with the church. You can't be going, just sitting down in the temple's restaurant or being near all of that. As a quick side note, think about it like this. We're going to church. We're going to a Christian church that preaches the gospel, makes much of Christ. What will we think of somebody that says, oh, I just, sometimes in the middle of the week, I go to Catholic Mass, or I go to a Jehovah's Witnesses service, or I go to Santeria on Tuesday and I do Santeria at my house. We would call them out and say, what are you doing going to those places? And they would say, hey man, it's not like I don't believe that there's anything like, I don't believe anything that they believe. I'm just there to like spend some time with some of the people that are my friends, or I eat with them right after, or I have a cup of coffee with them at their temples and just drink with them and say, hey, just talk about different things and kind of like talk about my religion, talk about their religion. We would talk to them and say, like, that's not a safe place for you to be at all the time. There's a lot of things that are going on there at that other place. It's a complete different religion. Do you consider yourself, do you consider yourself so high that none of that is going to affect you in some way, shape, or form? That's kind of like the effort of verse 22 here. Shall we provoke the Lord to jealousy? Are we stronger than he? It's kind of like a play on words on the beginning of this chapter. We hear about them. Hey, listen to me as wise people. And here he's saying, hey, are you guys considering yourself stronger than even God? You guys consider yourself so wise and so strong. Yeah, you guys can be in the idol temples as nothing is going to get to you because you guys are so strong. That's kind of like the effort of that's kind of like the point of why he is bringing that up. But the point of verse 22 is going to help us step into the next part of the chapter. Shall we provoke the Lord to jealousy? This brings up a lot of Old Testament thoughts. God is a jealous God. God is a God that is jealous for us and for what we're devoted to, but primarily, to be honest, in the Old Testament, God is jealous for what? Fill in the blank. God is jealous for his own glory. God is jealous for his glory. Isaiah 42:8, I am the Lord, that is my name. My glory I give to no other, nor my praise to carved idols. God did not deal with idolatry lightly in the Old Testament. And the same God of the Old Testament is the same God of the now for the Corinthian people. And they're saying, you guys are going just lightly and flippantly to temples of other idols. How did God deal with the Old Testament people that did that? God is a jealous God for his people, but for his glory. He's a jealous God for his glory. We're going to step into that in the next passage. But it says, are we, this second statement here, are we stronger than he is? Like, are you somebody that's going to challenge God on what he states? Are we going to simply, we're not going to mess around with somebody that's stronger than us? Are you able to mess around with God when he has been very clear in what his will is? He is a very jealous God. He is a jealous God for us. He's a jealous God for his glory. And the scriptures are very clear on that. So just making the repoint here, verse 14, flee from idolatry. You can get some meat from the market if you want to. It's not the deal here. If somebody comes and brings you some meat from that somehow is from the temple and it got to the market and then it got to you, that's kind of fine. We're gonna get to that in the next passage. But what he's saying is, do not partake, do not be participant with any of this, with any part of this idolatry. Flee idolatry. It has to do with demons. Flee idolatry. It has to do with demons. That's kind of like our negative statement there. Let me see. I got something in the chat there. Right? Somebody can, if they so desire, they can unmute themselves and maybe make it add something or ask. Somebody placed in the chat that there's a when Moses was performing signs with the Pharaoh, he was making the signs for the Pharaoh to appeal to him and let the Israel people go, demanding to free the Israelites. The Egyptians formed practically the same kind of signs, so we can remember that. Like the time that Moses threw his staff down and became like a snake, and the other people did the same, but actually Moses' staff ate the other snakes. But those are supernatural things, empowered by Satan and by demons. So thank you. That's a good point, Matt. I'm going to scribble like a bit of an outline here. We're going to go quickly to verse 23, all the way to verse 1 of chapter 11. I hope they can follow it. If nobody has anything to add or ask right now, I'm going to scribble on the screen so you guys can follow me here. But verse 23, wait a second here. This is the outline. So we can go through it with more clarity. 23 to 30, 31 through 32, and verse 33. Verse 11:1. When it comes to Christian freedom, we're going to go through the principles. We're going to go through the purpose. And we're going to go through the pattern. So the principles, the purpose, and the pattern of Christian freedom. So some principles, some quick principles on these several verses, then the purpose of it, and then the pattern of it. So if we have a negative statement in the last passage, kind of like flee idolatry, don't partake in anything with it when it comes to idolatry, and here we get a little bit more positive, and we're going to aim towards a statement of glorifying God. To just a quick introduction of the word glory, the word glory means something that is worthy of praise or exaltation, brilliance, renown. God's glory comes simply in two aspects: God's inerrant glory, God's ascribed glory. God is the only being on the universe that has inerrant glory. Like there's a glory to him just by being his own self. He creates actually other beings to worship him, but he by himself is just glorious by the mere fact of his existence. That's his inerrant or intrinsic glory. Now, his ascribed glory is what we're going to be talking about. And Psalms 29 says, ascribe to the Lord, O sons of the Almighty, ascribe to him glory and strength. It's simply giving him the honor due to his name, to recognize the glory that is already his. And us, our duty as beings is to glorify God. It's not that we're giving him glory, it's that we're simply accepting who he is. We're not making him making him glorious by what we do. He is already glorious, and we were created for the sole purpose of glorifying him. For some of you guys that know the catechism, they say, what is the chief end of man? And there's two things: to enjoy God and to glorify him forever. One of the purposes of humanity is to glorify God, to make much of God, to ascribe to him the fame due to his name. We are to ascribe to him glory. We are to respond and react and live as who he is. But it's going to get very practical in a sense, but I wanted to give since we're going to be talking about verse 31 in a second, some practical ways of glorifying God are in the scriptures. Confession of sin, trusting God, bearing fruit, thanking God, suffering for Christ, being content, praying, spreading the word. There are several ways that God shows his will to us in how we can glorify him. And I'm saying all those lists, and we're going to see this passage, but we have to think anything and everything that a Christian does simply has to be for God's glory. Everything and anything and all the parts of our life have to be for the sake of God's glory. Very important to kind of like bring that to mind in this age that we live in, where honestly, social media is so prevalent. Social media has become a part of what we do in our day by day. I'm not saying that social media is bad, but in a lot of it is bad. Some of it is good and redeemable, but honestly, by and large, how we see people using social media is, I heard a pastor say, it's like they're the star of their own movie. They are to live for their own glory. They think that all of their business is to be known by people, and they can have some sense, favor, or other people may see simply how good and cool they are. This is a worldly agenda, and this is completely dissonant. What we're about to read is completely dissonant to what usually the world is telling us to do in this day and age. We're simply to live for God's glory, not live for our own glory. Let's dive into the passage here. Let's see what the passage says about us living for God's glory. Verse 23, all things are lawful for me, but not all things are helpful. All things are lawful, but not all things build up. So I know that a lot of us can know that in this chapter, we already read this in chapter 6, verse 12. And I'll read it out loud in verse 12, chapter 6, 12. It says, all things are lawful for me, but not all things are helpful. All things are lawful for me, but I will not be dominated by anything. There's a difference there. All things are lawful for me. All things are lawful for me. And here in verse 23 of chapter 10, it says all things are lawful. All things are lawful, but not all things build up. It's not completely a restatement. It has the same quotes. It has the same kind of pattern, but it's not the completely same thing. We're talking about in chapter 6, we're talking about sexual immorality and all that. It's saying all things are lawful for me, as in saying there was a focus that was personal and individual. This one has the focus of other people. All things may be lawful, but not everything is helpful or building up towards other people. The other one was about not being dominated by anything. All things may be lawful for me, but not everything is beneficial for my own self. So there's kind of like a personal view in chapter 6. We have a more others view here in chapter 10. And this phrase of all things are lawful, practically was a most probably the Corinthian people were restating something that Paul heard, and they were misusing a truth that he said. Kind of like a side teaching there to understand that sometimes we can take the Bible's word out of context for the use of our own flesh. And here they're saying and repeating to each other, all things are lawful. Everything is fine. We can do whatever we want. We have Christian freedom. But he says, even though you have Christian freedom, don't misuse, don't misinterpret what I said. Chapter 6, it says, don't be dominated by anything. Here it says, don't be unloving and unthoughtful towards other people. Verse 24, let no one seek his own good, but the good of his neighbor. So here we're thinking about these matters that you guys say, oh, all things are lawful for us. We can do whatever we want. But think about other people too. Don't only seek out things for your own self, but also seek for the goodness of other people. So we have think about yourself in chapter 6. We have think about others here in chapter 10. Now we have a little comment here about eating. Verse 25, eat whatever is sold in the meat market without raising any question in the ground of conscience. For the earth is the Lord and the fullness thereof. It brings up the verse here, the cross reference. Psalms 24:1, saying, if there's anything that any meat or anything outside, hey, it's created by God. If you see any meat outside of the market and there's some meat that maybe has a lower price, don't be asking questions. Just if there's meat out there, it's okay to eat it. If there's any food out there, don't be asking if it's from the temple or not. Just enjoy the Lord's creation. Verse 27. Now here we have a little bit of a kind of like a situation here going on. If one of the unbelievers invites you to dinner and you are disposed to go, same thing. You whatever is said before you without raising any question in the ground of conscience. We have here a restatement from see, there's two situations being brought up here: the market and here, and the unbelievers dinner with unbelievers. So if it's at the market for unbelievers dinner, just eat it before you enjoy God's creation. Don't raise any question on the ground of conscience. Now verse 28 says, but if someone says to you, this has been offered in sacrifice, then do not eat it, for the sake of the one who informed you and for the sake of conscience. So if you're eating at an unbeliever's house and they're offering food and everything, just eat whatever is before you understand that everything is just simply God's creation, is made for our enjoyment. But somebody else comes and says, hey, somebody has a trouble with their own conscience, says this has been offered in sacrifice. We see this quotation here in verse 28. Someone comes and says, hey, this food actually that we're about to eat, this meat was offered to idols. They bought it from the temple. Then if somebody brings up that and you're actually not affected, the other person is kind of affected by that fact, it says, don't eat it. Not for your own sake. Look at this. For the sake of the one who informed you and for the sake of their conscience. Verse 29 gives clarity to that. It says, I do not mean your conscience, but his conscience. We're speaking here about the person that told you, hey, this food that we're about to eat was offered in sacrifice to idols. And they're saying, just because that person informed you and that person has a trouble with their conscience, well, don't eat it. The command here, don't eat it. The principle here is clear. If somebody has a trouble with something, you have your Christian freedom and everything, but if somebody raises up a question about the meats and about meat being offered to idols, and they say, I don't know if we should eat this is offered sacrifice, then don't eat it for the sake of them, not for the sake of you. This is further clarified in verse 29. For why should your liberty, my liberty, be determined by someone else's conscience? If I partake with thankfulness, why am I denounced for some because of that for which I give thanks? Which is reminiscent to 1 Timothy 4, where he restates that everything is good. And it talks about the topic of food and of sex if it is enjoyed with thanksgiving. If you give thanks to God for what he has created for your enjoyment and you enjoy it, it's completely fine. But if somebody else has an issue with it, somebody with a weaker conscience per se, and says, hey, I haven't, this food has been offered to idols, then the command here is clear. Don't, the principle is, well, then give up your right per se. Do not eat of that meat for the sake of their conscience. What would happen also with the unbelieving friend that invited you guys per se? He invited you guys, and now he's saying, hey man, we can't eat this that is right before us. We can't eat this food that was offered to idols. Aren't they going to be offended? They might be offended, but you're witnessing. You're witnessing to them a loving act between believers, because there's something that is against your conscience as believers, and they're seeing that being acted between you guys, and you're actually doing something loving for your fellow brother, and that is a witness to that person, even though they might be offended by the fact that you're not partaking of that meat. So we have this three characters here: the unbelieving friend, we have a believing friend, and your own self, and we're seeing how that situation would play out if that were the case, in a way that it would glorify God. Here are some, I'm going to just list up some quick principles as we just went through this passage a little bit quickly. There is here the sense of, I have 4 principles here. Edification matters more, or is more, than your own gratification. You can do whatever you want. You can do whatever you want with your own Christian freedom. That's clear. You can eat the meat, you can enjoy the meat, but if you have the chance to edify somebody with your actions, then you can give up something even that is pleasing to you, your Christian freedom, for the sake of edifying somebody else. I heard somebody unmute themselves. I don't know if somebody has a comment or something to add. Nope. Okay, there's also the matter here of thinking about others. Think about others more than you think about your own self. So we have others more than self, edification for the sake of gratification, more important than gratification, liberty, as you guys can see here, that let me see, where's it at? Let me see it here. We can see here that your own liberty is more important than legalism. You have freedom. You're not supposed to do things just because, because of it's not like one size fits all. We see that here, because if you don't have a problem with your own conscience when it comes to food being offered to others, then there's freedom. You don't have to be doing the same with them, but if you're around them and with them, then for the sake of them, there is a condescension. There's a reason why I'm using this word to here. There's a sense of condescension instead of condemnation. Don't condemn that brother that has a conscience that is weak or anything. There's a way, a loving thing with them is to kind of condescend, to kind of say, hey, I'm going to give up my right because of you. I'm not going to condemn you and say, you're dumb, idols don't exist, why are you making a big deal? We're right here in this unbeliever's house. Let go of your right for the sake of loving them instead of condemning them. So we have 4 principles there in Christian freedom. Edification is more important than gratification. Others more important than self. Liberty is more important than legalism, and condescension is more important than condemnation. Those are 4 kind of principles that we can use when it comes to kind of gray areas. Here's a general question for all of us here. Think about this. What have you done with your Christian freedom? What have you done with your own personal Christian freedom? Is there a time that you remember giving up something, giving up your right because of somebody else? That's something that kind of convicted me here. that there's not a lot of cases that came to mind, to be honest, but what have I given up? What freedom have I given up for the sake of other people? An application question from this last passage. Nat, do you want to say something?
Yeah, I wanted to ask if you may type up the 4 principles in the chat.
Yeah. I'll type them up and I'll put them there for you guys so you guys can have them.
Thanks.
So edification, more important than gratification, others greater than self, liberty over legalism, condescension, more than condemnation. So let's go through these last 3 verses. And we're gonna go through 2 verses, the purpose of Christian freedom, and then the pattern of Christian freedom. Verse 31. So here we can read this in beautiful context with more clarity. So verse 31, whether you eat or drink, and then it brings up whatever you do, it doesn't say anything that you do it all for the glory of God. Whether you eat or whether you drink, and we've been talking about eating and drinking the Lord's Supper and food offered to idols, and we go out to dinner with unbelievers, whether it is eating or drinking or whatever it is that you do, ascribe to God glory in every single thing that you do. There's our ending principle and the positive aspect about this whole passage. Anything that we can do can credit God and make him look awesome. That is the purpose that we have for our own existence. Look at this verse, this one in verse 32. Give no offense to Jews or to Greeks, but to the church of God. Why is he bringing that up? Because when you do not live for the glory of God, you make other people stumble. We're not talking about offending people. We already know that the gospel offends people. The gospel is an offensive message, but we don't want to give people a stumbling block to the gospel. We don't want people to think of us and see something that dishonors God. What would happen there with those people? I said, who cares about the people that think that food offered to idols is bad? I'll eat idol meat all day. I don't care about their conscience. That's unloving. That's not glorifying. And we are to be a church that is to be known for a love towards one another. So when we are acting in an unloving way and inconsiderate way to each other, glorifying or giving a stumbling block to the world, glorifying or giving a stumbling block to a church. Our lives, when they are not aimed, and people know and see that there is some aspect of our life that is honestly not glorifying to God, it's not making God look awesome, it's actually a stumbling block, then that's when people see our lives and they see there's something off about this person's life. It's not good. They say they're a part of the people of God, but their life does not look like it. What is that? Offense, a stumbling block. Verse 33, just as I try to please everyone in everything that I do. Here we're thinking about all that he talked about in chapter 9. Not seeking my own advantage that they may be saved. Why did Paul give up all of his rights? When he gave his example about his life and everything, he gave it up because he didn't want to place a stumbling block for other people to get to know Christ. He wanted to do everything that God had told him to do. He was seeking to please everyone so that he would not put a stumbling block between other people and God. He wanted to glorify God in everything that he did so other people would know God. Here's the matter. The purpose of Christian freedom is to glorify God. The reason that we are free is for us to glorify God, not for any other purpose. When you see somebody that calls themselves a Christian, if their lives do not live up to that, to the Christian walk, or to seeking to please God with their lives and not really passionate or not really seeking to obey God and do things that are pleasing to him, is dissonant. It's a stumbling block to you and to other people. You just say something is pretty off. They're not living for their purpose. And our purpose as Christians is to live for the glory of God. What's the pattern? Well, we have two patterns here. We have the pattern of Paul, and we have the pattern of Christ. The pattern of Christian freedom is we have two patterns. We have the example of Paul that we've just had explicitly, especially in the last chapter. And he says, imitate me as I am of Christ. We have the pattern of Christ. Paul is seeking to live a Christ-like life. Not seeking his own advantage, but giving up of his rights for the sake of others. And Jesus gave up of his rights in heaven for the sake of getting other people to nearer to God and for the sake of glorifying God in everything that he did. That's why I brought up the word condescension, because Jesus condescended from up high, from heaven, came down to human form for the sake of us being saved. And there's honestly a principle that we can follow by condescending for the sake of us, giving up of our rights, becoming lowly, like others, coming down to the where others are at in their understanding or in their conscience, for the sake of them getting near to God and for the sake of glorifying God. This is the way of Jesus Christ, to give up give up your freedom for the sake of glorifying God and loving others. So we see principles, we see purposes, and we see the pattern of Christian freedom in this passage. And I know that some of us may get into chapter 11 and kind of like try to understand a bit. Some people get into it to understand more of the Lord's Supper that's also here, but I think once we see it in context, we can see why it's being brought up. It's being brought up to understand more the reason why we're feeding idolatry, to not partake or be participant of demons, of demonic worship, of demonic acts. In our lives, it's supposed to be glorifying God. That means get away from idolatry as flee from it, run away from it, because your whole life and the whole purpose of your existence is to make much of God. You cannot partake with God and make much of God and glorify God and partake of the Lord's Supper and partake in some way, shape, or form with anything outside of that demonic worship. And as a big application for us as we're closing up here, man, what things that are outside of God are we just simply fellowshipping with? Are we partaking in different acts that we know they're not from God and they're actually taking people away from God, and we're simply just participating, enabling, or being having fellowship with some of these acts or with some of these people, without thinking, man, this might be messing around with my main goal, which is to glorify God. I was reading Matthew 5 earlier this week, and I got a little bit of insight into Matthew 5, where it says, "Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God." That's Matthew 5:8. Blessed are the pure in heart. Doesn't mean that my heart is doesn't mean exactly as clean, but terms that are more helpful for that is that it's the unalloyed heart. Is the heart that has no competing devotions or no, it has no divided loyalties. It's a heart that is the idea of being pure in heart is that my heart is completely His, giving God practically no reason for jealousy. My life is completely to Him and to ascribe Him glory. I'm living completely for the glory of Him, or like it says in the Catechism, to enjoy Him and to glorify Him forever. Being pure in heart is being completely given to glorify God. Is there anything in your life that is competing against that? Flee from that. Flee from that idolatry. Are you enjoying something that you know does not help you be devoted to God? Are you enjoying something that you know this sometimes messes up? This at times messes up with other people's devotion. Or there's honestly something off here about how much people are being sold out to this. It's completely against the Lord's agenda. It is for us to ask God for wisdom and discernment and seek to understand what it is, but the command of this passage is clear. Flee from anything that is outside of God, idolatry, and pursue God and pursue your purpose in glorifying Him. Let's pray. God, we thank you for this time here. We thank you for this time that we're able to spend together, God. Lord, I pray that we may, Lord, I pray you may purify our hearts, purify our devotion, our loyalty. Lord, help us to, Lord, ingrain in us, Lord, a desire and an understanding that we are to be living completely and solely for your glory. Lord, help us to understand truly who you are. You're a jealous God. You're an awesome and amazing God. And everything that you created was made by you, and it was also created for you. Lord, help us to enjoy the things of this temporary world in that way, knowing that it was made all by you and that it is all for you, God. Help us to live for you and reveal to us anything that is outside of that, God. Lord, I pray you may purify your church and do away, Lord, with worldliness or any things, Lord, that may be Lord, just grabbing our loyalty and devotion towards you. Purify us, God, and make us a pure and wonderful church that is devoted completely to you, God. I know, Lord, that is your desire, and our desires go in line with that as well. I pray that for us and for what this passage states and commands. I pray that for every single one of us here, Lord. I thank you for us time here together in Jesus' name. Amen. All right. Thank you for all those that tuned in. I hope this passage was edifying to you. It's certainly edifying to me. See you next week as we go into chapter 11. And hopefully, I'm very eager for the day that we will be able to meet soon. We already have the date that we're going to be meeting in person, physically, for our Sunday service, July 5th. I am hoping that soon, around that day, we're able to start meeting at the church building. So just be planning on the group meet or anything, so for that day to come. So, and any news in that regard. So with that, thank you, and we'll see you guys next week.